Today's speaker is someone you either know of or heard of, since he's been in the business since many of us were merely a twinkle in the eye. Hank Apgar from MCR is a lifetime ICEAA member and a co-founder of one of ICEAA's parent organizations, the International Society for Parametric Estimating. Today, Hank is following up on his paper from 2016 with part 2 of Assuring Credibility in the Cost Estimate. Hank?
Good morning. Good morning to the West Coast. Good afternoon to the East Coast. As Megan said, this is part 2 of an earlier paper, Assuring Credibility in the Cost Estimate. I got the idea for this paper about 5 years ago when one of my customers asked me, "How good are your estimates anyway?" And he wasn't being insulting, he just wanted to know. And I can remember farther back in time when I took my first price class in 1979, that the goal then was just to get a number, just make the model work. And if you did get a number, you could use the fact that this is what the model says in order to gain some credibility in your estimate. But that's not good enough now. And we are concerned with a bunch of parameters and new criteria. It's not enough just to use good models calibrated to verified data. But we have a step deeper into the rationale based on confidence level or realism or accuracy or reasonableness. I think sometimes that the goodness of our estimate is based on perception. If the customer believes it's a good number, and if he's a contractor, uses that number as a basis for a cost proposal by which he bets the company, and the government or his customer then believes that, yes, this is a good estimate or a good prediction of a future event, then we say, yes, this estimate is credible. Well, when I started writing the paper, I called around to my peers, and calling my peers is a technique that I learned recently in life, and that is I don't go alone with judgment, but ask people who you work with or people who work in the business who know as much or more than you do. I was influenced by a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. I highly recommend this book. You can buy it in paperback on Amazon for under $10. And it convinced me that a good answer to a complex question very much is based on the wisdom of crowds. I define credibility then as the quality of being convincing or believable. And I want to share with you my answer to the question, how can you assure credibility in your cost estimate? I questioned my modeler friends. I wanted to find out, what did they think? I then got in touch with many authorities in our world, and I define authority as someone who writes a textbook or a handbook. I queried executives, both on the government side and industrial side, to see what they think about how to instill credibility in a cost estimate. And finally, for your benefit, I boiled down everything that I have found into my own personal consensus that I will share with you. And if you saw my paper back in 2016 in Bristol, you may recognize that my consensus has changed just in the last 5 years. This is an evolving idea that is assuring credibility in our estimate. I began with asking cost modelers, and I consider myself a cost modeler, and I queried them primarily on the newer ideas involved in doing parametric estimates, ideas such as uncertainty in the estimate and joint confidence levels that integrated not only cost of the estimate, but the schedule for the estimate. I talked about technology readiness levels and system readiness levels. I explored the importance of cost growth as an input to our estimates. And finally, I have come to the realization that a good acquisition estimate is dependent upon a good understanding of the concept of operations, because the two are certainly entwined. One of my mentors was Steve Book. I worked with Steve at the Aerospace Corporation and again at MCR. He was an honest person. He understood the forces of economics and statistics, and he was humble enough that he answered every time I asked him a question, even as mundane as it might be. But he was famous for promoting the introduction of confidence level for any single estimate, where he projected the probability that the actual cost, which is a future event, will not exceed the estimated cost, which is my product to my boss or to my customer, and that is measured as the cumulative probability. So we show cumulative prob as a function of a range of possible outcomes, and my estimate is somewhere on this scale. And hopefully my estimate is higher than the 50 percentile and maybe closer to the 80 or 90 percentile. So it's more than just citing a range of estimates, but it's more with showing the confidence for a whole range of estimates. And I think this is the first answer to my question: how do we show confidence in the estimate? We show it by a graphic that displays the estimate confidence level. What about joint confidence level? What about the combination of the cost estimate and the schedule estimate? And how can we present them together with a joint confidence factor, a concept that was initially promoted by the General Accountability Office and promoted to great detail by NASA and some other government agencies, allow us to plan not just the confidence of a particular estimate, but the confidence for a whole portfolio of estimates and programs, and even to be bold enough to set confidence levels. Do we want all of our programs to be budgeted at the 70% confidence level or the 80% confidence level? Or we can work the numbers and we can show those presentations. And as we do that, we instill a level of confidence in the original cost estimate. TRL, technology readiness level, system readiness level, are additional factors or parameters which have become popular lately. And I quote here from a paper by Pat Malone, and the scale shows the technology readiness level. And on the government definition of TRL, that's a scale of 1 to 9 or 10. Some companies have expanded the scale to 25 or 35 such levels, but these become more precise measurements of the concept of a modification versus a new design, or the amount of new design that's actually required for a new product, and allows the estimator to be more specific and better able to communicate his assumptions regarding the readiness of the technology, which is a major cost driver. If we want to estimate, for example, the cost of a program required to develop all or part of its technology from a TRL level 8 from a TRL level 6, we can actually show metrics as a percentage or as a factor in one of our CERs that allow us to be more explicit and more rigorous in defining that impact on the estimate. Once again, improving the confidence in the acquisition portion of the estimate. So both TRL and SRL are factors that enhance the credibility of both cost and schedule estimating. Cost growth. Cost growth used to be the afterthought, that after we completed the estimate, somebody would ask, well, how well did we do on the last program? Did we exceed our budget? And if so, have you factored that idea into your estimate? History comes from many sources. This particular one from the Aerospace Corporation on a paper presented in 2016 at NASA Cost Symposium that shows the average increase in growth for a program from start to finish. And just as an incidental, which is interesting, is to show that payload growth tends to be greater than that of spacecraft growth. However, in any case, having the benefit of knowledge of cost growth in your business, your industry, for programs that are similar to your product and your current technology, you can actually incorporate this information into your estimate. And once again, enhancing the credibility of your estimate. Concept of operations, once again, often an afterthought that goes beyond estimating the cost of an acquisition program, and often estimated only by factors or multipliers on the acquisition cost estimate. But really, it's more significant than that. Concept of operations, by definition, is the stakeholders' description of what the system should do and how it supports operations. It is critical to life cycle estimating, obviously, because it's an important phase of the life cycle estimate, but it also impacts significantly on the development and production estimate. And I think of an example that within the maintenance or operations phase, we're concerned with factors such as mean time between failure. And mean time between failure, MTBF, is a function, in most cases, of the choice of components, of subsystems, and of the way those subsystems are operated. And those are also factors used in the acquisition cost estimate. So there's a real interdependence in the estimating of cost and schedule for acquisition programs as well as for operational programs. And once again, having done that, having looked at and considered concept of operations, when we do the development and production estimate, provides an enhancement and an improvement to credibility for the development and production cost estimate. So that's an overview of my conversations with my peers, the cost modelers, and that provided me some idea of how to define credibility. The second phase of my upgrade to my paper was to ask authorities, what do they think about credibility? Is that the right description? And if so, how do we define that as a metric for the goodness of an estimate? And I contacted people in and outside the government, and I defined authorities as authors of textbooks, journals, and handbooks. The oldest textbook in my collection for parametric and even bottoms-up cost estimating was authored by Rod Stewart. He published his first book, 1991, and he defined credibility. He advised that credibility, accuracy, and supportability of the estimate will depend to a large degree on the care, knowledge, and time spent at the beginning in developing a work breakdown structure. In his opinion, and I knew Rod quite well, and his opinion was, without a good foundation, you're just wasting your time creating an estimate, because you won't be able to communicate the estimate and the person who uses your estimate later won't really understand what it means. So without a good WBS and a dictionary, and obviously the dictionary has to define the elements in terms of an estimate. We estimate a unit cost, program cost for unit 1, for unit 100. Many questions that should be defined up front as part of the work breakdown structure. I like the GAO Cost Estimating Assessment Guide. This is one of the original government documents, first published in 2009. It also linked cost estimating with EVM, with Earned Value Management, because EVM and its reports are a good source of information for creating an estimate. It's a good history of similar programs, and it separates fact from fiction. It transcends the promises and provides us with real evidence of how a similar organization, probably our own, fared with developing a program or a product similar to the one that we're estimating. The GAO guide did more than just explaining good estimating. It also was a guide for government auditing standards. We think of auditing as a process by a government mostly, and contractors sometimes, to go back and double check an estimate, its process, its methods, and its conclusions as a guide to whether we want to award a contract or not. But the GAO guide, in this case, went farther and deeper and came out with a practical guide to how to prepare an estimate that would withstand an audit. And I'm going to show you on subsequent slides how this document and the thought process behind it led to the creation of ICEAA, the International Society of Parametric Analysts. My good friend Christian Smart, who up until a few years ago was chief of cost estimating at Missile Defense Agency, published his organization, Cost Estimating and Analysis Handbook. And I know from talking with Christian and seeking his advice on numerous occasions, he based his revised 1972 version of his organization handbook on the GAO guide and definition of what is required for a credible cost estimate. So he too was thinking not just of preparing an estimate for consumption of his manager and for Congress, who allocates and awards funding for his programs, but also for an ultimate agency review and audit. This handbook provides a guidance for any of us in government or industry or academia with a very lucid description of the estimating ground rules and technical characteristics pertinent to good estimating. He also stresses the importance of a good structure, the WBS. He encourages broad participation, including all stakeholders. That was a new idea for me because when I did my first parametric estimating for industry, I talked only with people from the factory. I really didn't bother talking with people who were going to use my estimate later and perhaps developing a cost proposal. That was a painful lesson learned for me. He stressed the importance of ensuring data validity when you do the estimate, and maybe collecting the data comes prior to developing the estimate. Certainly data collecting typically takes us more time than it does cost estimating. He insisted that we provide for program uncertainties, allow for the unknowns. Again, that was a new idea for many of us in industry back in the 1980s. We were lucky to have enough information to do an estimate, and we didn't even know what the concept was of what if. And finally, he stressed independent review, not just from his office, but by his peers outside his office. And I was privileged to be asked to do a number of those reviews for him. NASA Cost Estimating Handbook is probably ranks it in the top 5 documents that every cost analyst needs on his desk, whether he's government or industry. The handbook, besides describing how to do a good estimate, stresses that the estimate should include a reasonable description with risk confidence levels. What is the uncertainty of the input data, of the program description, and finally the estimate itself of every major component of the estimate? And that description should be sufficient enough for another estimator to reconstruct the estimate. The handbook stresses that we should verify the reasonableness and credibility of our estimates, and we should generate secondary estimates, fashionably known as independent cost estimates, or ICEAs. And I know that NASA, JPL is a good example, are big on going outside the organization and hiring small teams of experts to reconstruct the estimates based on the same information, but different models and different estimating techniques. That part of the handbook, by the way, was written partially in response to a GAO survey in 2006 that actually questioned the credibility of some NASA cost estimates. Not to pick on NASA, because everybody was guilty of failing those tests in the early 2000s, but to give NASA credit for heading and facing up that problem, facing it head on. So the sanity check has now become an integral part of all of our cost estimates. NASA, Marshall Space Flight Center, headed up for a long time by Andy Prince, good personal friend. He followed me as president of ISPA back in the old days. But I was particularly impressed by one of his papers, he's written so many, in 2011, that argued that the credibility is a quality metric. And that was the first I heard the term quality used as a metric in evaluating an estimate. But he argued convincingly that quality is measured by degrees of independence of the estimate based on sound technical and program baseline. And I have to admit that having been an estimator of ICEAs for NASA, that they have never started me without a comprehensive baseline analysis of risks and cross-checks with auditable historical data, a schedule linkage, and Andy stresses a new idea of quality and credibility, and that is a management culture with a desire to know the truth. I know that Andy works closely with his management. He doesn't want to surprise them. And when he gives them an estimate, they've already seen the result, they know what's coming, and they're part of the team that acknowledges that the estimate is of quality. Andy's predecessor in that job, and then later the director of Headquarters NASA Cost Analysis Division, Dr. Joe Homaker, another personal friend, wrote an article for the ISPA Journal in the early 20s advising, again using the term accuracy, that accuracy is important, but he cautions that we cannot know the accuracy until the project is complete. And he throws in the quip, he said, estimators think like engineers. An engineer is different from the mathematician in believing that a prediction of 7 rather than 6.999 is good enough. and probably even more realistic. And I think back to my early days of running models, in particular the price model, which was my tool of choice back in the early days. And we could show printouts with numbers of many significant figures. And I have to admit that my management was somewhat impressed with the number of significant figures in the computer printout, which actually meant nothing beyond the basic number and nothing beyond what my oral summary of the estimate was all about. Dale Sherman, again, a good friend from the UK. He works for Kinetic. He also endorses the metric accuracy in his successful textbook, Systems Cost Engineering. He stresses that accuracy can be improved by calibration, and he stresses calibration of the product and the organization, that is the product being estimated and the organization for which you're doing the estimate, as part of the model. So Dale's idea is it's too late to instill accuracy or credibility in the estimate if you haven't instilled accuracy or credibility into your organization and its process. He worked for Price Systems before he went to Kinetic, and so he often used the term ESERP. And those of you among the audience, and I see there's 36 of you in the audience today, and I assume that at least one or two of you was an early Price user when we used the term price spelled backwards called ESERP. And all that ESERP meant was a process of running the models in reverse, where the user of the model would input the answer and out would come parameters that would serve as milestones or markers that served as a calibration of how the model worked. We do that today. We do it by a different process. We don't call it ESERP, we call it calibration. Dan Nussbaum, past director of Naval Center for Cost Analysis, again, another friend, past CCEA president. In fact, he was CCEA president at the time that I was ISPA president, and we conferred many times, and I would think that my conversations with him eventually led to the mergers of CCEA and ICEAA and ISPA into the organization now called ICEAA. But Dan is now at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he's a department head and a top-level lecturer on cost and schedule analysis. He teamed with Greg Mislick, also at NPS, a retired Marine pilot, and together they published a book with a novel title, Cost Estimation, Methods and Tools. And in that book, they stress that the characteristics of a good estimate, more than the precision of the estimate itself, are the completeness, the reasonableness, the credibility, and the defensibility of the estimate. I had the honor a couple of years ago of visiting NPS, and I sat down with Greg and asked him more about the book. And he said that a good estimate is not having to prove your estimate is correct, but more to prove that your estimate is reasonable and credible. You show this by using sound mathematical techniques, and you show how you came to these conclusions. So again, it's not the number in the estimate, it's the way that you develop and treated and documented and presented the estimate that really counts. Space Mission Engineering is the title of a group of handbooks, affectionately called SMAD, Space Mission Analysis and Design, published in 3 editions and then superseded by the 4th handbook with a slightly different title called Space Mission Engineering, the new SMAD, and that was published in 2011. Probably due for an update. But the chapter 11 in that handbook, called Cost Estimating, stresses cost realism as the perception of the estimate. And the idea was beyond all the safeguards and the regards and the caveats that you, the estimator, would apply to ensure your estimate was accurate and reasonable and complete, etc. But also you can describe and present the estimate in such a way that the customer of your estimate perceives that the estimate is of quality and reasonableness and credibility. How do you convey that idea, and hopefully it's a truthful idea, that your estimate is on the track to predicting a future event? I like to use that caveat, predicting a future event. It was one that Steve Book used, and he continued to use it when he moved to MCR with me. And he would say that if you can convince your customer that the estimate is good, and the customer is generally skeptical, and rightfully so, if you can convince him of the perception, the good perception of your estimate, then it probably is a good estimate. So that's how we worked at Aerospace and NCR, was to display or portray the estimate with S-curves, etc., to show its goodness, its qualities, and its credibility. So we have procedures and tools, and we demonstrated cross-checks and second opinions. One of my favorite document and information sources is the RAND Corporation, located here in El Segundo with an office in Washington, D.C. And RAND was in the forefront of writing books and articles about system engineering, and one of its attributes, cost estimating. They reasoned that cost estimating was really cost engineering, and cost engineering was really a subset of system engineering. I still have on my library shelves books by Gene Fisher and some others from RAND who stress the importance of maintaining good databases, establishing good rules and good parametric models to come up with good program cost estimates. But the report that I really like, authored by Bernie Fox, who hired me into MCR, and he now works for RAND, is a book. It's a book written to be a guide for assessing cost estimates presented to the government by contractors. He calls it Guidelines and Metrics for Assessing Space Systems Cost Estimates. You can download it at no cost. And it's a guide to you, not just in reviewing an estimate by yourself or another contractor for use by the government in awarding a contract and establishing a program baseline, but to assure that your estimate, your own estimate, is credible. And it's all about the process. And the document speaks to you and stresses you would review your own estimate, and after review by an independent agency, together to verify completeness, consistency, and reasonableness. A lot of repetition here between what some earlier peers and authorities have said, but isn't that what a good survey is? Don't you look for patterns and consensus? The report also recommends the idea of a CARD, a cost analysis requirements description. But at the time the report was published, 2008, the idea of a CARD was already in use by the Defense Department. And a parallel by NASA called a CADRE, C-A-D-R, little e, which are documents written before the estimate, and an attempt to define and approve the requirements of the program being estimated and establish the ground rules for which the program will be executed. And lately, CARDs and cadres have touched on the subject of risk and uncertainty, once again, making the job of the estimator a lot easier than what it was when I started doing estimating, when you started with a clean sheet of paper and went around the office and around the factory asking experts, how long does it take to do this process, and how many are rejected or used and sold to the customer. Times are a-changing. And finally, my third level of peer questioning was to contact cost executives. These are the people who certainly are the customers of estimates. They're the customers who, in the case of corporations, make the decisions about whether to submit your numbers as part of the cost volume of a proposal, which in many cases bet the company. I've done consulting for very large companies, and I used to think that, gee, these guys who review our cost estimates don't really know much about cost estimating, and yet they're making multi-million-dollar decisions based on my numbers. In fact, one of my customers, a large helicopter company, asked me to help them train or retrain their estimators in order to better carry out this heavy responsibility. I contacted folks at DCAA, at the Air Force CAIG, then the Cost Analysis and Program Improvement Group, and lately renamed Cost Analysis and Program Evaluation, or CAPE, at NASA, at Lockheed Martin, and at European Space Agency, because this challenge of credibility is an international one. I mentioned auditing. Estimators are not auditors, and we don't do audits, and we tend to snub our nose at people who do audits, because after all, they're just accountants, and what do they know about estimates? But they review our estimates, and if they don't understand or don't believe or don't have confidence in our estimates, we got to do them over. The ISPA News in 1991 reprinted a conference keynote address by the Assistant Director for Policy and Plans at DCAA, who explained DCAA's policy on auditing parametric cost estimates. This was significant because at that date, in 1990s, contractors could not submit a proposal estimate based on parametric models. Sounds incredible today when parametric models, either in-house or generic, are the backbone of doing computer estimates for proposals. But in those days, those models were disallowed. Folks at DCAA became our friends, and they realized that we created ISPA in order to resolve an issue that we felt they created. But they came to the conferences. Some people referred to them as the bad guys, but they weren't. They were the good guys. And Chuck Starrett, then the NCAA director, explained to us the 5 rules that DCAA uses in evaluating any cost estimate. And then he went further to explain and interpret how each of these rules could be interpreted in the mind and process of the parametrician. He said, all of your relationships must be logical. We understood that. He said that your models and your CERs must be based on verifiable data. And by gosh, you better keep that data in your files in case we ask for it. All of your estimates based on logical relationships and verifiable data must show significant statistical relationships. And for simplicity, he defined those at high R squared. He said your estimates need to be accurate. And he said you have to periodically show that actual costs match previous estimates. Well, that's hearsay, was then hearsay, because nobody does that, then at least. But since then, we started keeping track of how the estimate and the program whose contract was based on the estimate might have changed and how that would have impact on the estimate. And finally, we have to show that our CERs and our models are continually monitored and updated. Later on, DCAA came back and wrote articles on what's wrong with the estimates, for example, not being based on actuals or updated data. And we didn't realize he thinks that our estimates over time are going to vary significantly, and therefore we should allow in the estimates for how the costs are going to vary in the future because of possible program changes or even contractor productivity changes. He says estimators and accountants don't communicate with each other. And boy, that was true. Lack of industry written policies and procedures. I know that's true because many companies that I consulted with would have policies and procedures, but nobody ever read them. Or I would ask an estimator, what does your policy say about the approval of engineering estimates? And you'd say, oh, I don't know, I've never read it. We just do the estimates. And finally, DCAA thought it was weak that estimates are made by persons who are not ultimately responsible for performing the work. Well, I have to say that that's probably even true today. So the barrier to the founding of ICEAA was the perception that parametric estimates could not be audited. But here was contrary evidence. And today, the policies of the auditors have changed and the attitude of the estimators have changed. And we use parametric models as the basis for many contractor program cost and schedule estimates. We began a series of journal articles, starting out with this journal and continuing with the ICEAA journal about what are quality estimates. And the first of the articles was by Rich Hartley, then chief of Cost Analysis Improvement Group, and he gave 6 reasons for the lack of quality. First, of lack of transparency with data sources. Secondly was not linking risks, real risks, to potential cost impacts. Thirdly, he didn't like extensively detailed briefings. He thought they were a cover for poor quality estimates. Failure to integrate schedule. This was in 2006 when we didn't integrate schedule with cost estimate. Lack of model calibration and overlooking many elements in the WS. He would cry the lack of specific estimates for estimates at the system of systems level, system engineering, program management, etc. Many cases, estimators, we would include those numbers right into the estimates of the hardware and of the software. And, NASA submitted the second of the 5 articles. Joe Hamaker explain the attributes of quality in cost estimating. And remember, Joe used the term quality in his papers earlier. He stressed the importance of reserve, program reserve as part of the risk estimate. So not only do we need to estimate the most probable cost, but some indicator of what were going to be the uncertainties in that estimate and where the extra reserve funds would come from, or how we could scale down the program if those increases did occur and extra funds were not available. And once again, he stressed management culture as being part of the climate of doing a credible estimate. Lockheed Martin, voice from industry, Dick Jonda, VP of Program Assessments, and Evaluation for Lockheed, from the contractor point of view, thought that estimates should be based on objective data. And he used the term for the first time, honesty. He thought that estimators were the honest broker. I was proud of that term, that an estimator was considered honest and above reproach and without a stake in a program, therefore not biased. And the estimator was more likely to tell you what a program would cost than would the program manager. The estimator had no axe to grind. He was not part of the game or of the success or failure of the program. His success was in predicting true cost. Army cost analysis and economic center, Steve Bagby, who was then the director, he established the Army Cost Review Board to combine multiple estimates from program office, independent agencies, etc., into a single Army cost position. He wanted to work with one set of numbers, one position, one target, and it was the combination or the consensus of opinion of many different estimates so that the Army could focus on budgeting and programming and not on creating the estimate. And I'm moving a little faster here to leave time for your questions, but I see by a note this morning that I have no questions pending. Okay.
Yeah, you have, go ahead for another 5 minutes. I haven't seen any questions yet. And if anyone wants to ask a question and change that, I'll jump in.
Okay, I'll continue in the meantime. You interrupt me if there's a question.
Will do.
I'm sorry, is there a question?
No, I was just, yep, carry on.
European Space Agency, Hervé Jumier, Chief of Cost, was invited to write one article on quality cost estimates. And again, he defended quality, not the lowest cost or the shortest schedule. He was bothered by the fact that when his agency would do an estimate, that the numbers had leaked out in advance. The numbers affecting the cost of a major program were already in the press. And remember that Europe does not have large organizations like the Aerospace Corporation who focus on doing independent engineering and cost studies, but rather by independent companies who had an axe to grind. So there was less independence, in his opinion, in Europe compared to the US. And so he was concerned by what he called the magic number concept, that before he would even publish his estimate with all of its caveats and statistics, that a number was already in the press as to what a large space program was going to cost. And then he had to fight the danger of poor estimates or naive cost estimates that everybody already heard and wanted to believe. Another paper by Andy, in fact, it was the best paper at the ICEAA 2015 conference, things to look out for when you do an estimate, and ignoring applicable data, putting too much emphasis on a single data point, using data that deviated significantly from trends. And this is the first time that I've heard that expression, but the reasonableness of an estimate is significant. We might have all the right statistics and all the right data and all the right rationale, but if we estimate the cost of a program that's not reasonable or is not consistent with past programs, we need to rethink our premise. Maybe the requirements are blue sky thinking, that maybe the requirements are unaffordable. And in fact, what we have come up with is a metric that measures the affordability of a program as much as its expended cost. And if that affordability is beyond reason, then we need to work with the using command, with the acquisition agency and others involved, other stakeholders, to come up with a different set of requirements that will result in a lower cost estimate for a program that can be affordable. Andy was concerned with changes in historical business practice. Suppose a contractor submits a bid and he already plans to sell off a major division of a major product, and that's the division that is going to do the work for the contract being bid on. Will that have an impact on that subcontractor's productivity or its rates? Of course it will. And so Andy was concerned that contractors were not disclosing those facts as part of the estimate, but rather waiting for the auditor to find out that fact many months or years later. Well, that completes my review of my peers, and I am going to leave time for questions, but first let me make a consensus of the wisdom of the crowd. And the crowd is our peers, our modelers, our authorities, and our managers. But our peers have collectively advised that cost estimate credibility can be assured by following 4 major attributes. And I said that this version of the presentation differed from that of 5 years ago when I had 5 attributes. I've simplified my conclusions. Number 1, process. The estimator needs a coordinated, state-of-the-art, transparent, and clearly defined estimating structure and process that is bought into by the user, by the acquisition organization, by the budget people, and even by the engineers who are going to do the development of the product process. Number 2, correct use of calibrated cost models. And I don't want my whole presentation to be limited to modeled estimates or parametric estimates, but the concept applies to bottoms up and analogy estimates also. Even analogies, even the analogy data points need to be calibrated for modern technologies, modern environment, a different production criteria, a different operating environment, space versus air, for example. So we need to use the term calibration very carefully in adjusting our data before they in turn are based on pertinent and verifiable data for the estimates. Number 3, a well-defined baseline. What is this estimate for? Is it a ROM? Is it for a proposal estimate? Is it for a budget? Is it based on numbers of people we need to hire next year to deal with the new business environment? But we need to define that fact, that requirement up front. And secondly, we need a full set of relevant cost drivers, and not just the amount of new design or whether the product is modified or brand new, but what are the transition TRL levels involved. Finally, number 4, we need not be proud. We need to take the time in our estimating schedule to request peer reviews, and peers far away from our immediate organization are better than peers and folks in our own office. And they need not only to do independent estimates, but sensitivity analyses and cross-checks. And those peer reviews need to be enhanced by joint cost and schedule confidence assessments, resulting in a combined estimate of the confidence of meeting both schedule and cost constraints. So there you have it. That's my update of my paper for affordability. I'm able to write updates to my paper because of feedback to all of my peers. I got many comments from the first time I gave this paper, looking and anticipating comments this time also. So Megan, I'll turn the floor over to you and our audience of 35 attendees, and hopefully somebody will ask a question.
We have a comment, really more of a comment than a question, from Karen Marikas. Karen, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay. Well, hey, Hank, that was a great job. I wanted to say that, well, first of all, I enjoyed seeing all the names, hearing all the names from people, from way back in the beginning of ICEAA and its predecessors. That brought back a lot of memories. The thing about ECERP, I had forgotten about that. I remember that now from like 15 years ago when I was first starting in this field, and it's like, oh yeah, ECERP, I had forgotten all about that. So you're bringing back a lot of memories, so that's good. And then I have to tell you, I loved your, and I've got air quotes here, your snide comments about estimators differing from mathematicians, or about snubbing our noses at the auditors, and because they're just accountants after all. So I thought that was great. So really good job, Hank. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Well, I take those as kind and complimentary comments. I appreciate that. And yes, writing this paper has been very interesting to me because I did recall many friendships, and our profession of estimating goes back over many, many decades, and we need to be very proud of the fact that we are the honest brokers.
Thank you, Karen, for chiming in. And we have gotten one more question. This one's from Sherry Stukes. Sherry, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead. Sherry, you're on. Well, I'm going to leave her. Okay, apparently the audio is not working. Sherry asks, or Sherry says, you mentioned verified data. Can you say more about how data becomes verified? How can you determine that it is verified?
Well, the verification of historic data certainly deserves a whole paper by itself, but I could summarize it and say that the estimator is at great risk using somebody else's database because he doesn't know if it was or how it was verified. It makes sense for the estimator to spot check and verify data to assume its source, assume or verify its definition. When I see data based on software costs, I like to know how many lines of code were involved, if in fact it's an estimate or an actual software development, and of the code that was used or delivered, how much of it was new code versus reuse, et cetera, et cetera. It's not enough just to take numbers out of an ECERP or out of an Excel spreadsheet, but to know the basis of those numbers. And too often cost estimators in the past were guilty of not verifying and even validating cost data they use to develop cost models and consequently cost estimates. So the burden is on us as estimators to verify cost data some way.
Okay. With it,
Did Sherry come back?
Sherry's audio wasn't working, so that was just me reading her question for her. And with it being 1 o'clock, we are just about out of time. In fact, probably out of time. I wanted to take a quick moment to remind everybody that the deadline for sending in your abstracts for the call for papers for next year's workshop is coming up pretty soon, November 3rd. It's 2 months. So if you want to get involved and write a paper like Hank has here and all of our other presenters this summer, please do. If anyone has additional questions for Hank, I've got his contact info up here if you want to jot that down. And if you're not able to, you can of course reach out to the ICEAA business office and we'll be happy to pass you along at ICEAA@ICEAOnline.org. I want to thank Hank for joining us today and everyone else for tuning in. You guys have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week, rest of your summer, and be good to each other. Thank you.